literally on top of a mountain in Arizona, watching the sunrise, and then later spending the day and watching the sunset. It was an incredible day, and good to get away and get some warmth and see a different part of the country than I'm used to. So, I just changed my text for this morning in the last 30 seconds, and so I'm going to be reading from 1 John chapter 4, beginning verse 18. 1 John 4, 18 to 21. And I want to talk this morning just a few observations about the abiding significance of Dr. King's life, very specifically in regards to our congregation, our church, our place in this city, in this county, and in this world. 1 John 4, 18 to 21. There is no fear in love. There is no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. Perfect love casts out fear. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, for fear has to do with punishment. Whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. Whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. And we love because God first loved us. We love because God first loved us. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. And we love because God first loved us. Those who say, I love God, but hate their brothers or sisters, are liars. Those who say, I love God, but hate their brothers or sisters, are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen, they do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen, they cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from God is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. The commandment we have from God is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. Let's pray. Grateful for this word, O God. Your love is eternal, enduring, everlasting, patient. We all have emerged from your love as our source. It is within your love that we live and move and have our being. And even on the days when we are least conscious and least in congruity with and in sync with and in harmony with your love continues to abide. Surround us with your love this morning. Speak to us out of your love and conform us more and more to your love so that we might be all that you created us to be in this time, in this place, and for this world. In Jesus' name, amen. So maybe one of the most important things that we would say in thinking about the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the centrality of the message of love as to what he taught. We might also say the same thing when we think about the teaching of Jesus. And by bringing those two together, I'm not saying that Dr. King was like Jesus, of the same status and the same centrality at all, but if anything, like James Lawson, the great civil rights teacher, said, you cannot really understand what Dr. King's life was about without understanding Jesus. So, in the same way that we have to look at Dr. King through Jesus' eyes and through kingdom eyes, we can also do the reverse in a very helpful and provocative way. We can look at Jesus through the eyes of Dr. King. And when we look at Jesus from the eyes of King's life and from the eyes of the civil rights movement, from the eyes of the freedom movement, we see a different Jesus than the pious, separatist, uncontaminated, non-controversial Jesus that some of us learned about in Sunday school. It's not the Jesus of the children's story Bible when we look at Jesus through the eyes of Dr. King. It's a different Jesus. King's life and the movement that he was very much a part of did not necessarily start, but was a part of, and the parts of it that he led were inspired by a different Jesus than the church has sometimes devoted its life to and believed in. And so when we come to Dr. King's life and we come to his teachings and we come to what we can continue to learn from him, one of the things we learn from him is that we need to continually go back and look at Jesus with fresh eyes and with new eyes. In 1 John 4, it talks about the centrality of love as a commandment that God has given, and how easy it is for us to brag and boast about how much we love God. And if anything, that has become sort of a central statement that churches around the country and around the world would always uphold, regardless of all their kind of doctrinal differences. They would want to stand up and say, well, we love God. But the test of that right here in 1 John 4, do you love your brother and your sister? Do you love your neighbor? Because John says if you don't love your brother and sister, then you don't really love God. And you have to bring those two together. And to me, that was the central revelation of what Dr. King's life was about. He challenged black churches and white churches to make their love of God very specific, not just within the safety of the walls of the sanctuary, but out on the streets, out in the lunch counters, in the movie theaters, at the voting booths. He challenged us as a church, and continues, I think, to challenge us as a church, to make our love concrete and specific and relational to the times in which we live. And therefore, in this week, when we begin the week with what would have been Dr. King's 88th birthday today, only 88 years old, actually, not that long ago. He would have been 88 today, and we begin the week with his birthday, and we will conclude the week on Friday with the inauguration of a new president. But that's not the end of the week, because on Saturday there will be an unprecedented set of gatherings and protests and speeches and songs and prayers like no presidential inauguration in this country has ever seen. There's an enormous irony to me in the fact that the holiday we celebrate tomorrow was instituted by President Reagan. It's an enormous irony, because I'm sure he did that for some political reasons in order to sort of co-opt and pacify a message, and yet because of that declaration, putting that holiday in place, tomorrow all federal offices will be closed, and everyone will have the opportunity, in the shadow of the inauguration of this new administration, to reflect on the life and significance of this man who stood for almost everything opposed and different and in opposition. So we come today to think of Dr. King not just as a civil rights leader, but as a Christian and as a pastor. And I want to especially focus on what Dr. King had to teach us about being the church. When King was pastoring in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, after completing his studies in Boston, his church was not a progressive church. It was not a politically active church. The pastor who had preceded Dr. King, a man by the name of Vernon Johns, was an exceedingly controversial character within the city of Montgomery. Johns had been involved as a black liberation pastor since the 30s. He was a brilliant man, basically self-taught, but could quote Greek and Hebrew and Latin was a remarkable man who was working on food justice issues in Alabama in the 1930s and actually had a garden plot in back of the church and controversially would sell vegetables on the front stoop of the church on Sunday morning as people came in. And the deacons were scandalized that their pastor was out there with a fruit and vegetable stand in front of the church, trying to impress upon the congregation that unless they stood up independently and provided for themselves, they were going to be in trouble. And Johns was this controversial character who would go toe-to-toe and face-to-face with city officials, but often without the backing and support of the congregation of which he was the pastor. He was fired several times from that congregation, but the final time stuck. And the deacons met together and contemplated what kind of pastor do we want to have to follow him. And they decided they definitely wanted someone who wasn't going to be controversial. They wanted someone who wasn't going to cause trouble. They wanted someone who was going to be just the opposite of the personality of Vernon Johns. Someone who was well educated and well schooled, maybe had a PhD from a prominent northern university. Someone who married well and was nice to look at and well spoken. Someone who looked good in a suit. And they hired this young preacher's kid from Atlanta. And he drove down from Boston with his wife Coretta and became the pastor of this Black Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama. He was still finishing his dissertation. He didn't have a whole lot of time to get in trouble. But as things so happened, Rosa Parks sat down on a bus one day, and a movement started to form there in Montgomery. And the Ministerial Association, being like ministerial associations are, picked the youngest member of their body to be the spokesperson and the leader. Because all the older and more experienced ministers didn't want to be caught in the middle of this. The untold part of the story, of course, is that it was the black women who were really behind all of this. Not only Rosa Parks, but all the other black ladies in the churches and congregations of Montgomery who were pushing their clergy and pushing their husbands forward to take a stand and to speak up. My point being that the church was not predisposed to cause trouble. The church had not been shaped in such a way, the black church had not been shaped in such a way to think that confrontation was compatible with love. They had not been shaped by the teaching of the gospel in such a way that they understood Jesus as a freedom fighter. He was the Savior who died on the cross. He wasn't necessarily the one who would lead protest marches in the streets or call for bus boycotts. The established clergy and the established churches had a hard time bringing this together and understanding how the message of the gospel fit with what the impetuous nature of Rosa Parks' action was calling and forcing them to do. And so they selected this young Baptist preacher, new to town, to become their spokesperson. And if you go back and you listen to that first remarkable, almost spontaneous address that he gave that night to the association in Montgomery, you can almost see the history of everything that happened after that beginning to unfold. A remarkable, remarkable address. And what that spurred was the first thing that Dr. King has to teach us about the church. That the church exists, that the church can exist beyond the walls. That the church can exist beyond the walls. What we have here is not some kind of hothouse plant that has to be nurtured only by the reading of the Bible and by prayer and by polite singing and nice handshakes and potlucks and Sunday school discussions, but that the church can also exist beyond the walls where Bible study and prayer are foreign and uncomfortable and seen as intrusive in some ways, seen as irrelevant. And Dr. King began to teach his church and began to teach the churches in Montgomery and eventually teach all of us that the church can exist beyond the walls. But he didn't stop there. He showed us that the church must exist beyond the walls. That the situation in which they were in Montgomery, the protest that Rosa Parks was sparking with intentionality and determination, actually, was a protest that would not and could not be carried forward unless the churches came out of their sanctuaries. That word sanctuary is such a telling word, isn't it? They came out of their sanctuaries into the streets. Churches cooperating with other churches. Churches cooperating with organizations and groups of people who did not go to church. And together, collectively, expressing their love for their sisters and brothers. Dr. King taught us that the church must go beyond the walls in order to be the church. A church that remains within the walls is not the church that's being talked about in 1 John chapter 4. A church that remains within the walls and sings and prays and proclaims we love God, but does not go outside the walls to demonstrate the love of brother and sister, John says that church is a lie. Dr. King taught us that the church must go outside the walls. The second thing we can learn from Dr. King's life and witness, that the church can begin where it is. I'm so impressed with the fact that he did not arrive in Montgomery with some kind of vision for national renewal and national change. He didn't come with a vision that he was going to turn over the entire world. He didn't come with some kind of vision that he was going to end segregation in America, or that he was going to restore voting rights, or that he was going to liberate the promise that would eventually lead to an African American president. He had none of that. He started where he was, with what was right in front of him. He started with the connections that his congregation already had. He collaborated with the other churches and the other people. Reverend Ralph Abernathy, a pastor of a different congregation who became his closest friend and colleague throughout his ministry. He started where he was. He started, as the poet David White says, close in. Take the first step. So he challenges us as a church to go beyond the walls, to not be confined. He challenges us to begin where we are. We don't have to take on the biggest thing imaginable. We don't have to imagine all the possible things that a new administration might be bringing down on us or setting loose upon us. But we can begin where we are, right outside this front door, right outside the front door of our own homes and our own businesses. We begin to look at the world with new eyes. And we start where we are. We start close in. Marshall Gans was a community organizer who worked with the Mississippi Freedom Movement in the 1960s. I didn't plan on talking about this, but it fits. And Gans later became an organizer with the United Farm Workers and worked with Cesar Chavez, and then he went on late in life actually and got a PhD at Harvard, and he teaches at Harvard now, and he also helped plan political campaigns for President Obama, both times, I think, in 2008 and 2012. But Gans tells the story about how working in Mississippi in 1965 changed him. He had grown up in Southern California, and he arrived in Mississippi in a place that he was completely unfamiliar with, working with a very impoverished, uneducated community, doing voter registration, doing freedom school programs. And Gans says what the conversion was for him was that when he went back home to California, he saw the world with Mississippi eyes. His eyes had been changed. His vision had been changed. What he was sensitive to and what he was attuned to, what he felt being evoked from his heart and from his imagination was entirely different than it would have been if he had not had that immersion experience, that concrete involvement with people who were oppressed and suffering and struggling. And that's what Jesus is trying to do with us in the New Testament. That's what we're invited to do in the Gospels, is to have that vision shaped so that we begin to see the world with the eyes of Jesus. We begin to see the world with kingdom eyes. We begin to see the world with Mississippi eyes. We begin to see Libertyville and Lake County in a different way than we would if we had not had that encounter. So going outside the walls, starting where we are. Third point I've got to find here as I open my phone back up. That's it. The big one. Dr. King talked about love in a different way. Dr. King talked about love in a way that wasn't sentimental. Love was not a cushy feeling. Love was not a warm puppy. Love was a force. Love was a power. Love was something that you could inject into a challenging, difficult, oppressive situation, and you could change it in ways that you couldn't change it with anything else. Love was a force that affected the way you carried out a boycott in the city of Montgomery. I watched Selma again last night. I recommend that as a Dr. King observance, perhaps. I watched Selma again last night, but love was a force and a power that you could bring that fit right along with negotiate and agitate and protest and witness. All of those words, all of those actions, all of those motives could coexist in the same place and in the same community, in the same set of actions and demonstrations. It wasn't like somehow our political life and our concerns for justice are over here, and our pious devotional life and our loving feelings for people were over here. But Dr. King brought them all together and showed that love was a force to be reckoned with outside the walls, starting right where you were. And it could be turned into a power that could make demands. It could be turned into a power that could stand up to injustice and brutality. It could be turned into a power that would actually make reconciliation possible, which is different than just compromise, which is different than just negotiation. That love was this incredible power and force that happens between people in the Christian context who have brought together the love of God with the love of brother and sister. And when you bring that together, it's like the alternating currents brought together. There's this incredible force and energy that's let loose. And we rarely see it because we rarely bring it together. So Dr. King showed us in his life, he showed us in the movement that love could exist outside the walls of the church. He showed us, I think, that love could begin by addressing the situations that are right in front of us. That we don't have to be guilty, like Mennonites often are, and many churches are, of loving places far away across the globe more than we love the people in our own city and our own neighborhood. He taught us that love actually makes a difference, that it changes things, that it can give us hope in the midst of dark times, that it can increase our faith and our trust as we see the way that love can succeed where nothing else can succeed. He didn't live long enough to outgrow his imperfections. It would not be fair to make Dr. King a saint. It would not be fair to hold him up as an idol or as an example for everything that we need an example for. He died at a young age, possibly unable to fulfill the promise that his life still held. But in that brief time, his life and the lives of all those who are often unnamed and too often forgotten, that remarkable, what I would call the greatest generation, many of whom are still among us today, they showed us the possibilities of what this country can be, of what it might mean to have a new and different America than the ones that we've ever known. And they showed us what it might mean for a different kind of church to emerge in America. And if there's any time in the history of our country, and because of the centrality and significance and power and influence that our country has, therefore, within the history of the world, if there is any time when we have needed the church to be something different than it has been, if there's any time when we have needed a church that is not complicit with empire and complicit with power, complicit with oppression, if there's any time when we have needed a church that would stand up and speak truth and speak love and demonstrate it, if there's any time when we have needed a church that would not just stand up and say, we love God, but would also demonstrate that we love our brothers and sisters, this is that time. This is that, this week for sure. And I just want to encourage you and urge you, if you can find any observations or celebrations tomorrow for MLK Day, whether it's even something that you organize on your own. I don't know what you're thinking about how you're going to spend Friday and Saturday next week, but there are going to be gatherings, there are going to be protests, there are going to be concerts, there are going to be demonstrations everywhere, easily accessible to anyone who wants to join them. And I would urge you to do that. I would urge it as your Christian duty to do that. To demonstrate to yourself and to your neighbors that your understanding of love of God includes the demand that you love your brother and sister. We've been given a powerful opportunity this week to bring the faith that we have inherited and the faith that we are called to embody together with a world that is in need. Let's not waste this opportunity. Let's pray. I pray that we would be people of hope. Lord, help us to be filled with hope. Not necessarily optimism, but a hope. A light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness will not overcome it. Help us to be people who believe that the story is still unfolding. We are not at the end. That the times and the seasons are in your hands. Help us to be people of a solid and determined faith that is unshakable by all that we see around us. Help us to put ourselves in harmony with, in line with, marching to the beat of your conquering love in this world. Help us continue on this freedom struggle that Dr. King was also a part of, that John Lewis was a part of, that Rosa Parks was a part of, that Diane Nash was a part of. Help us do this as part of our love for you, responding to your initiative in our life, responding to the promise that you hold out for North Suburban Mennonite Church in this place.
shaking us up when we are too secure, breaking our hearts where they need to be broken by the things that break your hearts, and giving us a courage like we have never even had the courage to ask for, so that we might be present, we might be relevant, we might be necessary and essential to the work that you have to do in this place at this time. We confess that we do not know the end of this story. We do not know the end of this presidency. We do not know the end of this week. Therefore, we act in radical hope, and radical faith, and radical love, knowing that the presence of your Spirit and your activity among us makes other things possible. And we do this with a joyful heart and an expectant spirit. In Jesus' name, by the power, we pray. Amen.